Hello there, and welcome to the 2020 Fall Financial Aid Workshop. And in this video, we're going to walk through some pretty crucial information about how to make education after high school a reality. And, that reality is that most people need some sort of financial aid assistance, whether it be from need or just good, smart money sense. And so we're going to talk about some different resources, different programs that are a part of this process, some timelines and information that you and your student will need to know. It is very important that both you and your student actually watch this video. And here's the important reason why. Because you are both a major component and a major contributor to this. Everybody's got skin in the game. All right. So when we walk through this, when I say that when I use the word you, generally that means the student. All right. And when I mention the parents, that's any parent or guardian. And so it is important that as we go through this, that you realize that's the case. For example, the student is the one who will be filling out the FAFSA, not the parent. The parent is brought in for different components, and you will be an important member of that team. However, when we're talking about anything financial aid, all the money is taken out in the student's name, with a few exceptions, and ultimately the student is the one that is responsible for this process. Okay, but it is a pretty big deal, and it does impact families. So this is a team approach, and so this is a little bit more. Everyone needs to be kind of contributing to this process here. And so what we're going to talk about is up here on the screen. So we're going to go over some basic information, and I will tell you at the end. I'm going to walk through and use a screen to write and show you kind of a fake example of how all this works at the end. So if you want to see how it all kind of comes together at the end of this, that's kind of where that will be. We will probably spend about an hour doing this. So I want to give you fair warning. Again, since this is on YouTube, please make sure that you know that you can pause it. You can fast forward if you need to. You can come back and revisit. You can rewind. All right, there are subtitles, and so ultimately just make it accessible to you, but it is a longer presentation. This is a little bit more complex, and I want to try to make sure to do it justice while keeping it as brief as possible while balancing those two things. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of these things you see on the screen, but let's get started with some basic information about financial aid. So what the heck is financial aid is the first question that most people ask. Financial aid is basically money that helps families pay for college or career schools or junior colleges, and this is applicable to a lot of different areas. This is not just for your college money. This is for all the different areas that you might think of. Okay, so below you'll see some examples of what financial aid might be awarded as. So just working down our list, grants, that's kind of the magic money that we would love to see happen. That's free money. So grants are money that does not have to be paid back, and usually that's from a state or an organization or a school. And so think of that basically like a free gift. Sometimes those grants are 1 year, sometimes they're renewable. A lot of times they might have some stipulations associated with it, like you must maintain a certain GPA, for example. The next one down is scholarships, and scholarships are going to be also, again, money that we don't have to pay back. Grants and scholarships sometimes are used interchangeably. Scholarships are generally something that you see more used when you've done something to earn it. All right, so maybe you applied for it and you earned a scholarship, where a grant is sometimes more associated with a need, where maybe you don't make as much money as a different family, and maybe you needed a grant to make that happen. The third one down is something that people, I think, cringe at, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is and why that maybe should not be, with some smart money management processes and ideas, but that's loans. And so loans are definitely something that if you don't need to take a loan, that's probably best. However, most people at some point in their educational career find that loans help make school accessible. So I don't want it to be something that you shy away from completely. It is something to do smart, and it's something to make wise decisions about. However, it's not something that you should necessarily avoid completely, going to school because you have to take out a loan. Okay, so there are some smart ways to do it and some dumb ways to do it too, and we'll cover some of those. And then some work study programs, and that's basically like having a job on campus where you get paid, and the money that you earn for sitting at the dorm front desk for a couple hours an evening, goes to help offset your tuition costs. So it's basically a cheap way to offset some costs that are associated with school in a pretty easy way that's flexible and works around your schedule. So if you're going to have a job, they're guaranteed to pay at least minimum wage, and then also that they're a pretty cush job. They're not super hard usually. So I would definitely encourage you to look at those, and that is something you have to request when you're filling out the FAFSA. So this just kind of covers, and sorry, the screen is crunching the words a little bit, so some of the T's are dropping down there, but basically there's 6 key areas of financial aid. All right, so we'll see at the top. So the top two green ones, and then that third kind of teal one are probably the largest areas of where money will come from. I would say 80 to 90% of money will come from that to help support you in school. So the federal government, your state government, and then the direct from the college and universities. All right, so those top 3 are going to be your major contributors. The bottom kind of turquoise purple colors, those are going to be something that you can seek out. So for example, if you have if you're as a parent have an employer, sometimes employers will offer scholarships for their employees' children. Ask about that. Look into that. We will have scholarship applications that will come up for seniors, usually in the springtime. So pay attention to that. And our local region really supports our students. I think I want to say it was about $400,000 or $500,000 last year, where just our local organization offered to our students. And so it's a big source of money for some students. And those awards are competitive and you have to apply, but we'll talk briefly about that in the future. But the main ones that we're going to be hitting on is going to be those green ones in the upper right, the federal government, state government, and some college and university scholarships and grants. So there's also different types in terms of how things are awarded. So there's merit-based scholarships. And again, kind of if you see the word scholarship, usually you associate that with something that you did, which is what merit means. So it's really what you're bringing to the table. All right, so you'd have merit-based scholarship or merit-based aid is I got a certain score on my SAT, I got a certain GPA, I played soccer really well, things like that. All right, the next one down is need-based grants and aid. So those are going to be based on the FAFSA, and that's going to be basically based on your family's income. And so that's something that is usually pretty automatic. There's not usually anything apart from doing like the financial aid applications that you need to do to qualify. And there's basically set thresholds that you must meet. All right, there's also non-need based grants. The CalGrant is kind of one of them. They have some need and non-need categories, and we'll cover the CalGrants later. But so there's need and non-need based grants, the student and parent loans, and we'll cover those more specifically. Work study. There's also if you have family in the military, there might be aid there, as well as things like saving plans, 529s and such. So who can get financial aid? And this is specifically, see the word at the top, federal student aid. Okay, and we'll kind of break down what that specifically means, because California does things slightly different. And they recognize some different things. But for federal student aid, and that's kind of the larger student aid, the Pell Grant and that kind of stuff falls under federal student aid. So you do have to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. Essentially, you need a social security number, all right, to apply using the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. And that's an important one, all right? And there are some students that might be impactful too. And so in California, the California state government recognizes undocumented students, and there's a process that undocumented students complete, very similar to the FAFSA, which is the federal financial aid application. It's called the California Dream Act application, or CATA, and that is basically a very similar process, but only goes to the state government. And that by doing that, you can be eligible for a couple different things if you are undocumented, which you would not be otherwise, which would be like in-state tuition rates. So that's a huge amount of money off, thousands and thousands of dollars from out-of-state tuition or international tuition. You can also qualify for different grants and stuff like that. For example, you can qualify for the CalGrant. You can qualify for institutional-based scholarships, where there are other states that don't recognize that. And so basically, if you're not in other states, if you are undocumented, you can't apply for the FAFSA, and they don't have a state program. So many times college costs are really, really high and usually out of reach for many families. So in California, it's a great supportive system and a great supportive state in that area. And so while you wouldn't be doing the FAFSA itself, much of what we're going to talk about is the same for almost all of it. And so just pay attention. The only difference is you're going to be filling out a different application process. Okay. So for students who are residents, you have to be a high school or becoming a high school graduate, entering an eligible degree or certificate program, and that's usually going to be any 4-year, 2-year trade schools. And generally, they're looking for, there's a few like for-profit organizations that would not be eligible. So most schools that you can look at are probably going to be eligible. If you have any questions, let me know. Males do have to register for the Selective Service Program, which is done through the application process itself. Okay, that is a requirement to receive federal student aid. All right, so that's something just to be aware of. And then you have to make, underneath there it says satisfactory academic progress. Again, we're going to cover this. I'm going to show you what this means, but I just want to define a few terms for you guys. So financial need is the word that we use and colleges will use to determine, okay, so how much money do we need to come up with to help this family attend school at our institution? And basically, every school is going to have this thing called a COA, or cost of attendance. You can kind of see that at the top of the slide. And that is a magic number that you can look up for any school, basically. And it's a rough estimate of the average cost of attendance for an average family. All right. And so that's going to be tuition, room and board, average books, and a few other miscellaneous expenses. All right, so you can find out what that is. And we'll do an example and I'll show you kind of how this all works. But just to give you some definitions, the next set of acronyms, which you'll hear probably a lot of acronyms during this, but I'll try to define them all, is EFC, or Expected Family Contribution. And that is the magic number that your FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, that financial aid application that you should all do starting October 1st, that's the magic number that application actually spits out. The FAFSA doesn't actually award you any money. The schools and the government actually award you the money. But they need this application to be completed to get this magic number, the EFC. And basically what that number is based on your income and some federal calculations. This is the amount of money that your family should essentially expect to contribute kind of off the top. All right, so this is kind of the cream on the top. And so they're going to expect, if you have an EFC of 1,000, that would mean that basically at minimum, your family can expect to contribute $1,000 essentially per year. And that is an important distinction that I want to make sure I mention before I forget to, is that when we're talking about financial aid, everything is done in yearly amounts and yearly timeframes. All right. So when you see any type of cost of attendance, that is not a 4-year cost of attendance. That is a cost of attendance for a single academic year. All right, so basically most students are going to need to multiply this process by 4 or 5. And also the application process is a yearly process. They're going to look at different tax years. They're going to be the process gets easier as you get older and go through it. But you do have to every year apply and reapply for the FAFSA or the California Dream Act to again be eligible to earn aid for the upcoming school year. So basically, if you want to think about it this way, you're going to apply for the FAFSA between October 1st and March 2nd in California of your senior year of high school. And then basically when you enroll in college, potentially in the fall, right after graduation, within a couple months, you're going to start this FAFSA process again in October of 2021. All right, so that's just what you need to think about. So that's basically the rough idea of how need works. All right, and here's a few factors that influence that EFC number. All right, so an independent student or dependent student. We're not really going to cover dependent students. I think people would like students to be dependent because it does make a difference on the financial aid calculations, because basically it leaves the income up to the student if you're dependent, which generally is low or none, versus the parent, which is usually much higher. All right, but 99.9% of students in high school are dependent students. I flipped that. Independent student is what you want for money wise, but it is all but impossible to be an independent student these days. And it's not even the type of thing where you as a family decide we're going to what do they call it? Where they make you go to court and make your student an independent student. And so ultimately, that is not even eligible to receive this type of independent dependency for financial aid. So don't even worry about it. There are very few circumstances that this will actually work. You will need, that will impact your EFC. The income of both students and parents for dependent students will impact the EFC. Savings amounts, assets, how many students are going to be in college at any one time. So you've already had a student go into college. Having a second one enrolled in college will reduce your overall EFC, as well as your family size. So if you have younger children that you're also supporting. There are a couple factors that are excluded from the federal contribution calculation, or EFC, and that's like your family home, if you own a family farm for some reason, and then like special retirement accounts like an IRA or a 401k. Okay, those are going to be, the values of those are excluded. But for example, if you have a family home that you live in, that's your primary residence, and you have a second home, the value of that second home and the rent or whatever else that comes along with it that you might be doing can be included in a federal calculation. All right. Before we get too far into this, I also want to mention that this is going to be kind of your basic financial aid workshop, and I can definitely support you guys, and I'll go, you guys can always make appointments and ask questions. I have some pretty generalized tips and tricks and experience with this. If you have some pretty complicated financial situations, if you own businesses and all these other things, or if you have a lot of things going on, typically that's going to be a referral that I would suggest you seek out with like a CPA or a financial aid office at a college. Usually when we get that deep into financial aid questions, it goes beyond kind of my area of expertise in giving you kind of sound, valid advice. And so I would, recommend that you seek that out from a trained financial aid financial aid person or a financial advisor who knows all the ins and outs of different laws and rules, because there are some laws associated with this and you don't want to get yourself in trouble. Okay. The other thing that I want to just mention too, before we get too far into this, is going to be something that most schools are going to want. There will be a small percentage of schools that will also use a secondary. It's not typically not either or. It's usually a second financial aid application. And typically they're going to be very expensive, usually pretty selective institutions that have a lot of merit. They award a lot of merit-based aid. And so, they're very expensive. So they need some additional information to determine if they want to give away those hard-earned endowment dollars. And there's a second application through actually the College Board called the CSS profile. And again, there's about 200 or so schools around the nation that use this, and some are required, some are optional. And so you might just, if you're looking at like private schools, usually pretty expensive, usually pretty competitive, you might want to look into that sooner rather than later as well, just because the CSS profile is much more lengthy and then the FAFSA actually is. You'll actually be able to complete your FAFSA in shorter time than we probably work through this workshop. It's not super hard. As long as you have all the right documents. The CSS profile is much more lengthy. It does take into account other things like your value of your family home and other factors, the custodial and non-custodial parent income. There's a lot more things that they look at. And so what their goal is really to kind of get a better picture of the overall family financial situation. And so if you're thinking about applying some of those different schools, you might want to just Google CSS profile schools. And usually the first result that pops up is the link to basically all those schools that are available that have that program. So you might just want to dive in, and before you get too far into this, make sure you know the applications that you're going to need to fill out. So let's break down a few of the federal level programs. And again, these are going to be programs that are only available if you have a Social Security number. So these are not going to be eligible for the California DREAM Act application. All right. So these are federal programs that are offered only for people who can complete the FAFSA. And we'll get to some of the state-based programs. And there might be some alternatives now at the state level as well for things like maybe there might be state-based work study, for example. But basically, Pell Grant, that's a need-based grant. And it does have a maximum amount per year. And that's actually approved by the Senate every year, the United States Senate. And so it's about $6,000, but it fluctuates based on what they approve. It usually only goes up because inflation is going up. It is based on your need, your cost of attendance, and whether or not you're full or part-time. Okay. An important distinction is you cannot receive Pell Grants for 2 or more schools, and generally this is going to be most important if you're applying and maybe attending a junior college. In today's junior college climate, it is not uncommon to maybe take, especially if you're like in like LA or a place with multiple junior colleges within kind of a stone's throw away, you might be taking classes at more than one school. So you can't apply these grants to more than one school at one time. That's an important distinction. There's a few other awards here. The one I want to just highlight real quickly is the Work Study Award. That's the cush job on campus that I would encourage you to look at going. This is something that you do have to say, I would like to be considered for work study when you're filling out the FAFSA. So I do suggest that you do so. That way you don't miss out on the opportunity. By filling out the FAFSA, by saying, yes, I would like to be considered for work study, that does not sign you up for a job. It does not sign you up for loans. It really just gives you an opportunity to see the award package at its fullest. All right, so don't feel like anything that comes through on this, what we call the financial aid award letter, is something that you have to accept. If you get loans and you don't want them, you don't have to take them, even if they're offered to you. So loans are basically lumped into 3 main categories. All right, so there's a direct subsidized loan. So that's subsidized is kind of the magic. If you have to take out a loan, that's kind of the first one you probably want to take out. That means that the interest on that loan, so if you take out a $10,000 loan, the interest doesn't start accruing until after you've graduated, and typically there's even a grace period after that. Okay, so the government actually pays it. It helps your credit, so you actually earn credit because it's being paid while you're in school. And then you leave. If you take out a $10,000 loan, which is a little heavy, but you might need to, say as a freshman, it will still be $10,000 when you graduate. Versus the second one, which is a direct unsubsidized loan, and that basically is similar, but the interest starts accruing as soon as you take it out. So a $10,000 loan taken out as a freshman in college will not be a $10,000 loan when you graduate. All right. Some best practices sometimes I've heard is while you might not pay down the principal of that loan over your time in school, if you have a job or things like that, sometimes you might want to pay down the interest so that it doesn't kind of start ballooning on you. So you might pay $50 a month or something like that in interest to make sure that loan remains low. And then the bottom one is federal plus loan. And plus loan is generally an extra loan. It's usually a little bit higher interest. And generally it's for parents. All right. So this does, for the first 2 things like parent credit is not taken into account for the first 2. So students are going to be looked at individually for that. And so, for example, if a parent has like a bankruptcy or poor credit or things like that, it doesn't matter for the first 2. The last one it does. All right. So the federal parent plus loan does look at the parent's credit report, and so they will potentially not, if you're, they might not make you eligible for that. And there are a few things if you don't. So, for example, on this is a few years back, but roughly I didn't change it because roughly the numbers stay about the same. All right, so you can see as students get older, generally their loan amounts get a little bit more, so they're able to take out a little bit more money as they get older to cover amounts. They do that on purpose. But you can see if the top one is for parents who were eligible, and the bottom one is for parents who were not eligible. So they can actually take out a little bit more in the student's name if the parent was not eligible for the plus loan. All right, so plus loans are something that, again, kind of like most loans, you want to avoid. That's kind of the last priority if you can. But that's definitely a family decision based on kind of what your priorities are for after high school. So let's talk briefly about some of the state programs. So the biggest one in the state program is called the CalGrant. And the CalGrant is basically 3 separate awards. And so it kind of breaks down by roughly this graphic that you see on the screen. The left kind of y-axis there on the graph covers like your annual family earnings or how much income you generally have. And so you can see that each grant kind of covers specific areas. All right, so generally CalGrant B is specific for low-income families or lower-income families, and it basically covers the equivalent of the A grant or the C grant plus some additional living expenses. All right, so that's probably the most quote-unquote lucrative grant, but it's also designed for families that probably need it the most to make education a reality. CalGrant A and C cover some different things, and if you want to look up the specifics, I would definitely Google some of those things. CalGrant A is generally for 4-year schools, and CalGrant C is typically for junior college or trade schools. And so CalGrant A can cover generally up to tuition up to 100%. So that's about $12,000 a year at a UC, and I think it's about 7,000 or so. I might have it on a feature slide. About 7,000 or so at a CSU. All right, so that's kind of roughly that piece. And then roughly above about 90,000 or so, 88,000 I think it is when you can start qualifying for the middle class scholarship. And so that actually reduces the tuition amount based on kind of like their own calculation at the institutions, and that applies for both the California CSU and the UC system. And I have a slide up here in the future that I'll talk briefly about that. So applying for a CalGrant is really easy. You generally apply in your senior year, and or within 1 year after you graduate. The big thing that you have to do is, number one, do the FAFSA or the California Dream Act. Okay, so that is the process to apply for a CalGrant. There's no necessarily special process other than kind of checking and tracking the application, which is on our next slide. However, you do have to meet the March 2nd deadline of filing your FAFSA or the California Dream Act. That is a hard deadline. If you do not meet that, you will miss out on quite a bit of money from the state. So it's definitely something that don't push that March 2nd deadline. Try to get that in early, the FAFSA or the California Dream Act, in case there's anything that doesn't get processed or get sent through. That is a hard cutoff. And so if I've had students, unfortunately, try to file March 2nd and something didn't get received successfully and it impacted their financial aid award. All right, so you want to make sure that you're planning a little bit ahead on this. Don't push that deadline because that's a big chunk of change. To track your California Dream Act, you go to webgrantsforstudents.org, that website you see on the screen. You might just want to write that down. And basically, once you've submitted your FAFSA, it will update you with how much money you have earned over time and with the CalGrant, and how much you're awarded, or why you potentially weren't. And that might be a good thing that you want to check too. Sometimes people are not awarded something and they want to know why, and that's how they will find out, is by logging in there. And sometimes it might say your income wasn't qualified, you didn't have a GPA. And if you didn't see here, the AA grant has a 3.0 GPA, and that's a CalGrant GPA. It's not just kind of like your general GPA, so it's a specific GPA that we calculate and send in for you. And then C is a 2.0 GPA requirement. So there is some basically achievement related grants here too, and that's kind of what they would call the entitlement grant. All right. And so the other great program in California, and some schools might call them differently, but at the California Community College System, they actually waive tuition. So the free tuition is what they would call it. And a lot of schools will call it the California Promise Program, and they'll waive that tuition for up to 2 years. They do have some attached requirements that you need to pay close attention to. For example, like you have to pursue a certain number of units a term. All right. So generally they're going to ask you to complete the appropriate amount of units to basically get you through a transfer program or a degree within 2 years. At most schools, it's about 15 units a semester. All right. And so that's something. They might also have like a orientation program, or they might have like required advising to continue to receive free tuition, which is generally advisable anyways, but they just they attach it because they know it helps people get through. This amounts to about $1,500 a year over 2 semesters, and so it's not a small amount of money. And actually, if you lived at home and you rented books, you can get out of 2 years of junior college education to help transfer, get a degree pretty inexpensively, probably with no loans and probably with very little impact overall, apart from like the already expenses that you're paying for living at home. So how do I apply for this aid? And so like I mentioned, there is an application. It's called the FAFSA, or the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. You can see it there. That's what the acronym stands for. And you'll actually be completing the 2021-2022 school year. If you're watching this prior to October 1st, one important note is you should not start that until October 1st, 2020. Okay? Because you'll be filling out the incorrect year. It is not open for your year to complete the FAFSA or the California Dream Act until October 1st. All right. Many states, California included, make their awards based on the FAFSA data. All right. And this is important because I go back to kind of like you might not necessarily make enough money to get quote unquote the need, or you might make enough money to not be eligible for the need-based awards. However, many states will do this to award things like CalGrant, which you might, or the middle class income scholarship. And you might need some of that support to either make college less expensive or make it a reality. And so doing the FAFSA feels like it's a no-brainer for us that work in the industry. So definitely, I think every single senior should do it because it just makes the process easier, even if you don't think you're going to go to college or school, because a lot of times people change their mind. School aid will oftentimes, if it's merit-based data, let's say a private school, they might have a separate application, but oftentimes they use very similar process like the FAFSA or that CSS profile that I mentioned. And then scholarships are generally going to be done through different applications outside of the school itself. So there might be a school might have a separate scholarship application you complete. We have a local scholarship application process that you'll complete. And then for your tax year, you're actually going to be using the 2019 tax year. And we'll talk about what that means given 2020 in just a minute, because I know there will probably be questions about that. We'll get there, I promise. So the 2019 tax year, which should already be done for most people. If you have extensions or things like that, I would suggest trying to wrap those up as soon as feasible because they will need the filed taxes to complete your FAFSA. So the middle class scholarship is something that California does as well. And that basically is determined on income and assets, and it can go up to $184,000 a year. All right. And so basically, as you go between kind of the lower end of this threshold and say the upper end of the threshold, you're going to fluctuate between the 10 and 40% of system-wide fees, which include tuition. And so it's not a full tuition waiver like a CalGrant might be, but it is a percentage. And usually probably if you're upper 184, you're probably closer to 10%. Okay. And it is applied after all other need or merit-based aid. So this is going to be filling any gaps. Okay, so that's important. So that might be just a small amount, depending on what's offered. This is no extra effort, just like the CalGrant. It's part of the FAFSA. Okay, but you must attend a CSU or a UC for this to be applied. This is not eligible for like trade schools or junior colleges. The UC Blue and Gold Opportunity Plan actually covers tuition and fees with scholarships and grants for families with a total income less than $80,000. All right, and again, there's no application separate. Just do your FAFSA or DREAM Act, but you have to do it by March 2nd. All right, and you can look up that. Those are pretty important things that will help kind of that middle income group really be able to access education at the CSU or UC level. All right, so let's get into a few specifics about the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act. So to file it, again, the FAFSA, you have to be a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen and have a Social Security number and ARN, all right, or Alien Registration Number is what that stands for. The numbers will be verified. Okay, this is going to be run, if you type it in, it's going to be run against the Social Security database. Okay, so you need to enter both accurate and existing Social Security numbers. This is not a place to plug in a bunch of random numbers or a fake one or your uncle's or things like that. Okay, they will be checked. It's a big deal. Number one is they can get you in trouble for that, but number two is you might qualify for aid, and they will check this. Like, they don't just give away free money to anybody. Okay, so just be very careful with that. An important distinction, though, is this is for the student. The student must have citizenship and a social. Okay, the parent does not need to be a U.S. citizen. Okay, so that is an important thing that you need to understand, is as long as the student has citizenship, you can fill out the FAFSA. The only difference that generally will make is how you sign it at the end. Okay, and we'll talk about the FSA ID in a second. I'll come back to that. If the student is not a U.S. citizen, okay, the student will not qualify for the federal aid, but can be eligible for that California aid that we just talked about by completing the California DREAM Act, which the link is down below. The DREAM Act looks kind of like this, all right? And like I said, it's very similar to the FAFSA. It's going to ask very similar types of questions, and you'll click the start button, and right down there towards the bottom it says select here, all right? And you'll create an account. Again, students are the ones that should be making any accounts. Parents, please do not make accounts. When you make accounts, you make double accounts, and it creates a lot of mess. So communicate with your child, okay? They are the ones that are doing this, so make sure that they create the account and they know that they are the ones in charge of this. The FAFSA kind of looks like this. All right, and so on the left side of the screen, you see the Start Here button. For the first time as a student, you're going to click that and start the process. Once you've actually created your account, you're going to use the right button, which is the login button. So don't always start one because, again, duplicate accounts really kind of screw this process up. There are deadlines. Like I said, March 2nd. Up here I have California listed, and the new one's not available yet, so it's the old one, 2019-2020, but it should be the same. But basically, if you are applying in California, great, apply by March 2nd. If you're applying to schools other than California, it's important that you check their state deadlines. All right. So usually other states are probably not going to award you state-based aid unless you're a resident, but it's important because they might have a priority for potentially institutional aid too. And so you just want to check different states if you're applying out of state. You do need to collect these pieces of information. So first and foremost is your social security number. Again, make sure it's accurate. Kids, do not guess. Talk to your parents, find it, get the actual card, look it up. Okay, you want to check that. You will also need prior, or this for this coming FAFSA season, the 2019 filed taxes, federal income tax returns. W-2s are helpful, or any other records of money earned. All right, if your parents did not file taxes, it's going to be tough to apply for federal financial aid. All right, you're going to enter your income, but generally parents are required to file taxes if they are required to. And that includes undocumented parents too. All right, so undocumented parents will need to file taxes to generally be eligible for federal financial aid. So it is important just to have the records of that. If you haven't filed, it might be worth it to file now, pay the penalties. That would be, again, something you would want to discuss with someone who knows taxes better than I do. Any bank statements or investment records, records of untaxed income. You will need an FSA ID, which is kind of like your electronic signature. And that's something that parents and students, each parent and the student will need. And so that is an important piece that we'll cover now. And so the FSA ID, Federal Student Aid ID, is a username and password, and that provides that access to personal information. This should be treated like a PIN code for a bank, like a social security number. This is not something that you want saved on your notes on your phone. It's not something that you want sticky note in your car. It's something that you should keep safe because they have access to a lot of information that's pretty private. All right, financial aid information, identity theft information. So just really be careful with it. Parents and students will need their FSA ID, and they'll all need to apply. So it's an important process, and there's a website when you do that. And generally you'll start that when you do your first registration. But parents, if you have, this is another circumstance where if you have other kids that are already in college, you probably already, if you've done the FAFSA, you probably already have an FSA ID, and you just need to, when you're signing it, you don't need a new one. Just use your current one or click the forgot my password option if you think you have one and you don't remember what it is. Okay. So really pay close attention. Everything should be as like the government knows you. So like don't use nicknames, shortened names, use it exactly as it is. And make sure you remember your email, password, username, that kind of stuff. Okay. The FAFSA does have some pretty great help, actually. It's one of the few government agencies in the college process that I find actually is pretty good with providing help. A lot of times people have questions, and there's a pretty dang good chance that if you have the question, there's a bunch of other people that probably had that same question. So before you kind of like freak out or pause and then just email me a question, make sure you use their FAQs, their question area. And then over here on the next slide, you can see on the right-hand side, and this is in the help section or the contact us section, there's 3 options to actually contact them. You can call them, you can email them. What I've had the most success with is actually the chat option. It's the quickest I found, and it's less, I don't have to sit on hold. I can chat and do other things while I'm talking with them. So use that. It's very helpful. They can provide some information that they, you might get stuck on. Many of the problems that people have are pretty common problems. Very rarely are they like this, this special problem or question that arises. So just make sure you use some of the resources that they've put a lot of time into creating and making available before you kind of Either just say, yeah, forget it and move on, or just send me an email, because I'll probably go to the same place. I'll probably search it here too before I get back to you. The other thing that I highly suggest is using the IRS Data Retrieval tool. Okay, and what this does is, as long as parents and students are U.S. residents and citizens, you're going to have this IRS Data Retrieval tool, and you should be able to do this. And I would highly suggest that you do, because here's a couple different things. It takes a lot of the questions out of what number goes here. It basically pulls your filed federal income tax for the correct year and puts all the right information from that form into your FAFSA. It really takes like 20 steps out of the process. All right. The other thing that it does is it essentially avoids a financial aid audit called verification. About 1/3 of every applicant, of all applicants, gets selected for a process called verification, which means over the course of your 4 years of high school, there's a good chance you'll probably be asked to be verified. All right. And what that does is it asks you to submit some documents that prove what you entered on the FAFSA is accurate. All right. So you don't want to get stuck in a place where your information is not showing correctly. All right. So this process, by connecting it automatically, actually verifies you automatically. So I would highly suggest it. It's well worth it. Okay, we're going to take just a few minutes to talk about special circumstances, because this is likely going to be a place of many questions. Special circumstances are something that can't be reported on the FAFSA. All right, some examples might be, maybe you lost a job. Okay, you see in the blue box down there, medical expenses, you got maybe divorced since your 2019 FAFSA. There's different things that might have come up. And most likely, given that the 2019 FAFSA year or tax year is what's going to be used this year, 2020 kind of hit everybody pretty hard sideways, and there's a good chance that maybe you might qualify for several of these special circumstances. And your income looks very different maybe than it did in 2019. All right, so there is a process for this to happen, for this to be considered. It's called professional judgment. So that's the word that the colleges will use. And, it's a process where basically you provide some information to the financial aid office, okay, not admissions, financial aid office, and typically after you have applied and received your financial aid award letter, usually not before, okay? And usually they're going to request some additional documentation. They're going to need to see, your up-to-date income, that kind of stuff. But they have a process that you'll have to go through to show these special circumstances. Okay. There's a few things just to keep in mind. Their special circumstances will probably be higher this coming year. All right. So I'm anticipating that people needing to apply for special circumstances, the number will balloon pretty drastically than normal years. All right. And this is actually a good thing and potentially a bad thing. All right. The good thing is I think colleges are going to be kind of expecting it. And I think they're going to also be a little bit more understanding, for lack of a better word, to the special circumstances that 2020 provides or puts us in. However, just because there's a larger number of special circumstances that doesn't necessarily mean that the colleges have a lot more money to spread around. Okay, so it could actually potentially have a negative in that with more requests for financial considerations, they might not have nearly as much money to be able to spread it around to everyone that needs a little bit more help. Okay, the last thing on here is really important because sometimes I'll hear parents or students say, I have two colleges and I'm trying to get them to, I'm negotiating with them. This is not a negotiation. Okay, this isn't like putting two job offers against each other to offer you more money. That is not the circumstances here. All right. They like you because they admitted you, but they really don't like you that much. All right. Unless you're like a Division I star quarterback athlete, like most likely they're not going to be batting an eye that if they find out that you're kind of putting two people against, two colleges against each other, they might very well not like that very much. Okay, so really only focus on like the legitimate changes of income, the circumstances that are really impacting you. This is not trying to get a $10,000 reduction because it makes college more attractive. Okay, so really focus on those key things. Again, it's not a negotiation. After you complete your FAFSA and go through the process, like I said, you'll get this sheet, which is important to print or save because it has a couple different things. It has the confirmation number, which you can provide in case anybody says you didn't submit this. You need to be able to show this. Data release number is something if you call support, you'll need to provide the DRN. It gives you an estimated EFC right there kind of in the middle of the screen. You'll get a final one later on, but that's kind of roughly what you probably can expect. Potentially, estimates on loans, and then different information about the colleges that you added to your FAFSA. Students will also receive a student aid report, and then the colleges will also receive what they call the ISIR approximately about 2 weeks or so after the FAFSA is submitted. So there's some processing time that happens. The college will then review that, and they might actually ask for more information directly from you. And so please make sure you're paying attention to any of those requests. And then ultimately, they will provide what's called a financial aid award offer. And we'll look at a few of these. And again, in just a minute, I will go through some specifics about how this actually works and show you on the screen. However, roughly, they're going to say, okay, here's up here at the top, you'll see the estimated cost of attendance. This is 2 semesters, 1 year, living on campus and in-state resident. Okay. And so your expected family contribution for the student would be 0. So basically they say that is your need. All right. And then they spell out how much they're giving you. Okay. So you can see that they got it down to how much it is. So basically if you took every single thing that they offered you, you pay 0 out of pocket. Okay. And we'll kind of highlight that piece later. We talked about some of this already, so we're going to kind of skip over it. Just a review that I added as well. So the FAFSA does take into account student work. So there is 2 actually areas where it's asking you for income. One of them is anytime it says you, again, it's talking about the student. And then when it says parent, it's talking about parent. There's another thing that I just want to make sure that you realize. So sometimes students have parents who are divorced. And essentially the rule is you list the parent that you spend the most amount of time with, 51%. And so that is kind of the rule there. So if you have 2 parents that one makes significantly more than the other, and you spend 75% of the time with the parent that makes the most money, you need to list that parent. If you are separated or things like that, but not formally divorced, there's generally you're considered married still, and so you have to contribute both of those incomes on that application process. There's a few other finite differences that if you have specific questions on, we can kind of look up some more specifics on, but generally that's how it works. The biggest one that most people ask about is if my parents are divorced, and that's the big one is if literally custody order says 50-50, pick the one with the lowest income. That's the secret. Okay. But if it doesn't, you have to be honest and pick the one that has you're spending the most time with and use that income. We're going to talk just briefly in just a second. I'm going to show you how this works and show you on screen. But I just want to remind you, cost of attendance minus EFC equals your financial need. And this is kind of what you might get at the end. I'll show you 2 samples of an award letter. And most typically this isn't come in a letter anymore. It's usually like an email or through your student portal, but it lists kind of up here at the top. You'll see information about your tuition. Okay. It breaks down the cost of attendance. It breaks down the EFC. Okay, so how much the student should contribute, how much the parent should contribute is $4,500. And then it breaks down how much each of these different awards over here are, and you can see the total matches the cost of attendance. And we'll talk about what happens if it doesn't match, because that's the bigger deal, is if things aren't matching. Here's another sample, more for a private school. Okay, so you'll see cost of attendance $55,000. It breaks down what that cost is for. Okay, and it shows you how much you're being offered. And some schools will break it down like this, where it separates like the free money, scholarships, and then things you might either have to work towards or pay off. And you can see they didn't actually meet that number. And it doesn't necessarily say on this one what the EFC is, though. So it is an important thing. Oops, sliding too far. Here's another one. We're going to skip that. The last thing that I just want to highlight before we jump into a quick overview is going to be the college cost comparison tool. So basically this is something that you can see the link at the bottom. It's on the college advising section under the counseling website. This is a spreadsheet that I created, which automatically calculates. So on the top line, it's really handy when you're starting to compare, college financial aid offers. Along the top, each row, each column has the different schools. So you put the names in at the top, and then basically underneath that, you can list the expenses. So what's the tuition and fees? What's the room and board? What's the direct cost paid to the colleges? Okay, so it's going to add that up for you. Then you'll put in like books, transportation, personal expenses. All right, so this is going to be something that you have to account for as well. So like not necessarily paying someone, but you're going to have to pay for yourself. All right, so it shows you the total cost of attendance. And then I also added, it multiplies it over 4. And this is a scary number, but it's important, I think, that you look at it in that sense too. Because that's really kind of the investment that you're going to be making over time. And that's an important thing when you're considering the differences, and you might see some pretty drastically different numbers on there. You'll also see the financial aid, be able to put in the financial aid offers down below. And that calculates, and basically what they're going to do is let you know if you have any additional gap, meaning, do you have any additional money that you need to come up with? This example that you see on the screen, this student actually earned more money in scholarships and loans and stuff like that if they took it all out than what they're going to be charged per year. Okay, so they might choose to take out less, say, loans, or maybe not do work study because they have that gap there. All right, but it's nice to be able to kind of look at it one place. So I would definitely suggest you download that. So I'm going to wrap us up on this side of the presentation, and then in a second I'm going to hop in and show you and walk you through, when I can write on my screen, how we're actually counting some numbers with a real example. But as I said, please reach out if you have questions. It's a very complex process. It's the easiest complex process there is. Okay, the actual process of applying is not that hard. Understanding how it works and understanding the ins and outs and kind of the variations that come from applying for financial aid is the complicated part. All right, so I would suggest, like I said, 100% I think everyone should apply for either FAFSA or the California Dream Act. And then really it's about kind of like looking at your options once you've investigated them fully to determine what's going to be the most attractive option from admission standpoint if you're applying to a four-year college, for example, and then also which one's going to be attractive from a financial aid standpoint, and they might not be the same. All right, so thank you for watching. Stay tuned while I go flip over here and do your walkthrough. So as you can see on the screen here, we have a sample of an financial aid award letter that you might get in the mail or an email. And I'm going to show you two samples and just a quick pointer and just on the screen here. And what you're seeing is basically it's broken down in some of the different areas that we talked about already. So up here at the top, we'll see our cost of attendance, or COA. So I've gone ahead and put that up here over here, COA. And then not on here, and many times not on your financial aid award letter, is this number. We'll use 2000 as the EFC, or expected family contribution. So basically what they're trying to do is they then subtract this number, and then this 36,400 is now the need. Okay, so basically that is the number that the college is then going to be working towards to try to get to the best place it possibly can. So they do this down here in this area. All right, so they are going to then, this is your financial aid package. And so they've broken it down into two areas, basically. One of them is here at the top. These are all the loans that they've then packaged with you. The loans are a part of the package that helps meet the need. And so they're going to give you an opportunity to take out loans. And like I mentioned before, you have to be smart with it. But many times it is something that makes accessing your education possible. So what we've done is we've moved this $28,400 over here into this the financial aid package. And so what that does, assuming that we took out all the loans, so that is, let's see, about $7,500 in loans. So ultimately, what you're going to be looking at is you still have this $8,000 left over. So this $36,000 on top of your EFC, okay, you have a gap. And that is a space where the college doesn't offer enough money to meet your need. And this is an important number that you'll see vary from college to college. Some colleges will get much closer. The goal is to get to zero, but that's not always possible. And so this is a number that essentially you'll have to come up with out of pocket to make attending this college a reality. So again, the closer it is to zero, the better. So ultimately, if we add your EFC and your gap, you're going to equal about $10,000 out of pocket that you'll have to be able to pay for that year's schooling. All right. That doesn't include your loans, which will be then paid back later. Okay. So the $7,500. So the total annual cost is $17,500 after financial aid. Okay. The free aid for this particular school. Another example that we'll look at here is, if I can get this page to turn, is another school which does a little bit better job of explaining how the financial aid works at their school. So you'll see a little bit more verbiage here. And basically, they're using two words to describe this. So they're saying gift aid and then self-help options. Gift aid is going to be that free money. And then self-help options is going to be that work study or any student loans that do either have to be worked for or be paid back over time. So ultimately, their cost of attendance is $45,000. The same EFC is there. So when we do that, that gives you a need of $4,300. So they're going to get as best they can close to that number. This school might be more like a private school in that they offer what looks like pretty healthy, what looks like merit-based, potentially merit-based aid. And so they're saying here, they make it easy because they say here, you have gift aid or free money of $34,000. So that's easy. Okay, so free. Don't have to worry about that. Just take it. Okay, so that leaves you with a $9,000 remainder of the cost. And so this could be a couple different things. You could essentially take out additional loans. All right, so maybe you decided that you wanted to take out these two loans here. Okay, $5,500 in loans. All right, and then you don't have to. If you didn't take any loans out, you might have $0, or you might have $11,000 remainder. Okay, but ultimately, what they're offering you here is if you took all the loans in the work study, they're actually offering you $300 more than you need. Okay, so the $2,000 plus any amount taken out in loans. All right, so that's $9,300 total, would be kind of what you're on the hook for to make this school work. So that is more of a family decision about how do you want to approach these loans. You might want to start with, say, the direct Perkin loans and the subsidized loans, which I talked about cover the interest over time before taking out some of the other ones. But it's totally up to you. This school actually looks more potentially attractive than this one. So let me show you a last example here. And this really kind of shows and demonstrates the difference between a public and a private school, and why potentially you might not want to write off private schools right off the bat because of their higher sticker price. So this might be a good comparison between, say, a UC and a private school. One note that you might need to know is really take a look at this cost of attendance. Sometimes this number here that you might see might just be their tuition costs. The room and board, for example, may be added on top of that, which gets you upwards of $80,000 in many places. And so you just have to understand what the cost of attendance is taking into account. And so with this UC, you can see maybe you have, your cost of it. Let's see if I can get this pinned right on here. Cost of attendance. And then maybe this will be a grant, say like a CalGrant, and this will be loans. Okay. And so ultimately that gets you down here. This will be your gap. Over here, this is your cost of attendance. You might get a merit-based. Come on, pen. Merit-based aid. Okay. This is the same grant. Usually it's a little bit less if you use it at a private school in California, and these are the same, essentially the same loans. So that gets you about a $5,000 gap. Okay, so you get a difference of $13,000 or $5,000. All right. So over the course of 5 years, so this is, average graduation rate is about getting closer to 5 years at most CSUs and UCs. And so you do have to take that into account, and graduation rates are important. Many private schools will have a 4-year graduation guarantee, meaning they guarantee that you'll have the classes needed if you keep up your end of the bargain of doing well in school to graduate within that 4-year time frame. And if you don't, for things that are not outside of your control, they will then waive the cost to finish that degree. Okay, so you're going to be on the hook for that amount. And so that 4-year graduation timeline looks like about $20,000 or so out of pocket. Okay, minus the loans. You have to keep in mind the loans. This is really just looking at the gap here. So it's a little bit more with the loans. The CSU or UC options are going to be looking more like $52,000 with this gap in mind over the course of 4 years, if that number doesn't get brought down somehow. Okay, why the graduation rate matters is because you're adding an additional year, not only of this tuition rate that you're paying of about $23,000 total with the loans and the gap per year. Okay, you're also not working. So you're missing out on missed wage opportunities. So say an average graduate with a college degree might be making about $40,000. Hypothetically, you could subtract that from that overall number for a year and add that total to the total cost. Whereas if you graduated in 4 years, you really can add $40,000 to help offset that cost potentially that you might have faced, say at a school that was a little bit larger or more impacted. UCs and CSUs are doing a lot of work in this area. And so it's not something that you just necessarily have to shy away from, but it is something to be informed about and use it to help make good decisions.